We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
Hello and welcome to The Interruption with Chandran Nair, the Global Institute for Tomorrow podcast. Now, today's episode is going to be slightly different, actually. We're going to hear a short story by Chandran. That's a good anecdote for how some worldviews dominate others and how speaking out is actually seriously important. It's a short autobiography, actually, so you'll get to find out a bit more about the man himself. So, without further ado, take it away, Chandran.
No, thank you. So what I thought I'd share is something that almost by accident I began to speak about at an event a few years ago, where I found myself irritated, both questioning the wisdom of so-called thought leaders in the world. Invariably, they tend to be Westerners. That is not to say you can't have Western thought leaders, but I was questioning, why is it that, particularly, this was at a forum I was on geopolitics in Singapore, where we had leaders from different parts of the world. But the question about Southeast Asia and what is happening in Southeast Asia was being addressed by the American ambassador. And I thought, how odd that someone like that would speak about Southeast Asia, invariably deny the truth about the Vietnam War, the crimes that were committed, and yet everyone would go away saying, well, this is the truth. And so it brought to my mind a lot of questions about why is it there's no Southeast Asian speaking here? Why, if there were Southeast Asians there, why no one would say anything? And then at the height of the Iraq War, which is about 15 years ago, I was also very surprised by how the depiction of what was going on in the Middle East, in the world, and Islam, etc., was constantly being framed through the lens of people like Tony Blair, etc., who, as far as I could tell, probably never met a Muslim person till he became a diplomat, never met a Chinese person, or at least I'm sure never knew anyone as a good friend, and was not culturally immersed in any of these things. And then there's, of course, George W. Bush, who screwed the world up, but apparently was going to solve a big problem in the world. And I thought, my God, why do these people speak for the world? Because they did speak about the coalition of the willing as though they spoke for the world. So I came up with something what I called, which I'll share with everyone, called I Beg Your Pardon, I Have a Different Worldview. And I think this applies to all of us from different parts, but who are silent. Yet we allow, particularly during that era, the Anglo-Saxon leaders from the US, UK, etc., to describe the world to us. Yet they have no experience of the world. George W. Bush had never traveled outside the United States. So I think I'm more qualified, and we should speak up. The problem is, why don't we speak up? And I've talked about this in previous podcasts, about the subservience of the mind of the previously colonized and the tyranny of English. But in terms of why my worldview is different, and particularly if I'm addressing it to a more Western audience, or an audience that is purely Chinese or Indian, from Indian China, because I come from a very multicultural background. So it goes something like this. So I was born in a Hindu household, got up at 6 a.m. and we lit the lamp at home, and I prayed to gods that looked like elephants, monkeys, and I never questioned it, and I was told to pray to those gods, and it was actually a nice discipline. It gives us some kind of rooting in culture, etc. But that was my upbringing, a Hindu household with prayers in the morning before going to school, and I even prayed in a language I didn't understand a word of, was Sanskrit. But as I say, I was cool with that. That's the upbringing, and that also had a lot of create a lot of discipline and rules, etc. And then at about 7, we'd go to school, and I went to a missionary school, and I found myself being taught by strange white men in or at least managed the schools by white men in white gowns, with then some Asian teachers. But we all learned to say the Lord's Prayer, and they told me that God was blonde, white, and blue-eyed, and I was fine with that too. So this enabled us to be tolerant, understanding of different religious beliefs. No one questioned it. And of course, later I found out this guy was actually not so white. It was actually probably an Arab, probably didn't speak English, as they kind of made us feel that he spoke English. And maybe even a fictitious character, but who cares, fairy tales. So, but we just went with it, and we respected all of those things. I learned the Lord's Prayer and all of those things. No questions asked. At peace with two different religions, embracing them within the space of an hour on the same day. Right? No contradictions. So that creates a great amount of flexibility and tolerance and openness of the mind. And then during the day, of course, these missionary headmasters and missionaries had a strange fondness for caning little boys on their backsides, which we didn't question then either. Neither the Hindu scriptures nor the Christian ones told us about this thing. But I think now I understand that the Pope's kind of looking into it. Why they have a particular fetish for little boys, but setting that aside, then you go home, and we lived very close to a mosque next to a kampong, and we pass the masjid and go into the masjid and get sweets, etc., and then go home. And until today, the call for prayer, the Muslim call for prayer, in my worldview, is probably the most spiritual call. So wherever I go in the world today, I like to stay in Muslim countries. I like to stay next to the mosque. So here's a Hindu boy, went to a Christian school, but also likes the azan. Is it called the azan, I think? And the call for prayer. So till today, I love it. And I look at the nuance. I look out for the nuances of the different sound for call for prayer. And whether I'm in Iran, Turkey, Abu Dhabi, Indonesia, or in India, I love the call. I wait for the call at the 7 p.m. And if I'm staying next to a hotel where they pray at 5 o'clock, I'm not complaining to the hotel manager, because I understand. It's a respect for what the culture is. And so even with that, I have great respect for all the religions. And therefore, when I see young men from the Muslim faith with long gowns and skull caps and beards, and with a rucksack, I don't walk on the other side. I am not fearful. They are my brothers, so I am happy to say Assalamu alaikum. I know their religion. I do not think of the stereotype of, which has become now a stereotype of every Muslim being potentially a fundamentalist. I have great respect for them. So that's a different worldview again. And then in the evenings, we'd all go to the Chinese coffee shop and have our steamed buns or char siu pao. And here's a young Indian Hindu brought up in a Christian school, and we all learned to eat with chopsticks at the age of 4 or 5. So I was brought up with Chinese people. And so today when I see Chinese, I'm not like the average American thinking here are the uneducated hordes coming over to take over our civilization and feeling threatened. I see people who are hardworking, come from an ancient civilization, have a tremendous work ethic, and are very respectful of the whole traditional learning, etc. So having said that, I wanted to say that so people like us, in those few minutes that I've described, and this is not just me, there are many who have this experience, we have a very different worldview. We have a worldview which is more embracing. Of course, there are parts of the world where we're actually going backwards. So even in Malaysia today, um, I'm not sure if I can go to the mosque because some guy might say haram. This is going backwards. But traditionally, this has always been, it's been my experience. So I have a worldview that has been shaped by that of religions, cultures, and at time that we talk about the clash of civilizations, people like us understand. We are more tolerant of the differences in everyone, and it's almost embedded in the way we think and we behave. It's almost automatic. So, my I beg your pardon is essentially a question to foreign experts, particularly from the West, who try to describe the whole world to us, and particularly the world of the four major religions and cultures that I described: Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, Taoism, Buddhism. Well, none of these people had any of these experiences nor lived within situations where they had to exercise tolerance and live with others. So, how dare they tell us what the world looks like? The sad part is, why are we all quiet? So, I beg your pardon, I have a different worldview. That's why I share it. And I want many more young people to understand, to immerse themselves in the other, get to know the other. And don't be afraid. You might actually learn something. But one thing I can guarantee, if you immerse yourself in the other, you will be richer for it. You will find things that you could not understand. But if you immerse yourself in just your own thing, for sure you will be poorer. So I beg your pardon. Thank you. Any questions?
Good question. So there's a day in the life of Chandran Nair. Although I can tell you now he's a bit older, the days don't get any less busy. They're still as eventful, that's for sure. Thank you for sharing, Chandran. You've centered your discussion there around four religions. That was the pillar of it, and the different cultures that surround it. So, is the solution to expanding your worldview exposing yourself? Is it as simple as that?
Well, it's not as simple as themselves. And I think I also just want to clarify, you said that was a day in my life. I think it's more about it was what our days looked like, and yet we subconsciously were immersed in this extremely rich life. But until we were older, we couldn't completely understand what it is. And my point of view, that realization came, 34 years later, but in the context of the geopolitical discussions of the last 20 years. Why are we allowing ourselves to be influenced by the ideas, the ideologies of people who do not have our same exposure to differences and our greater tolerance for others? Why? Then within our societies, why are we letting people with extreme views hijack our the opportunity for us to immerse in the other? So to your point, is the exposure important? Well, exposure has different levels. And someone today like me who's privileged, I have the opportunity to expose myself. And even with that opportunity and that privilege, there is still the curiosity. Okay, so, but I am privileged at this point in my life to be able to go. For those who are not so privileged, and that's the majority of the world, exposure means something else. Exposure means willing to expose yourselves to the ideas, the lifestyles of the neighbor who is different. It could be someone who comes from a different race. It could be someone who comes from a different religious background. It could be someone who has different value systems. It could be someone who appreciates even just different types of food and immersing it. So that exposure is very different. So all of us are restricted, but clearly those of us who have exposure to new ideas because of our education, and then depending on our economic status, have exposure that extends our geographical sort of exposure, then we're the lucky few. But the danger in these conversations like this is, and I want to make it very clear, is the assumption that most people can travel and go to all these countries. Most people can't do this, and it's okay. The exposure, the mindset I'm talking about is the mindset of no matter where you live, being exposed to the other who's in your vicinity, and then being exposed to new ideas. Now, not all of us will have tutors or parenting that allows us to expose ourselves. In fact, a lot of parenting today is, people who do not necessarily have their exposure themselves to allow the next generation to expose themselves. So I think it's fundamentally getting this idea around that it's not about simply exposing yourself through social media to things, which is what people think about, because those things in itself, I would call a lot of social media is anti-exposure, because we know what search engines do. So they drive you to a cul-de-sac. Eventually you drown in the cesspool of mindless ideas of the people who think like you, right? That's not exposure. But exposure is it's a mindset, and then aided by your curiosity and your economic status to essentially go and touch and feel and get into things, depending on how easy that is for you. But economics plays a very important part in this.
Yeah, sure. And a word that's been running through a lot of what you said is immersion. So why is it that beyond exposure, you need to immerse yourself in something that's different?
Well, because you can expose yourself by just being an observer.
Yeah.
Right. But the best immersion, the best exposure is when you go and feel it. I mean, a good example is food, right? I know so many people, even in a multicultural society like say in Malaysia, where you have some of the best opportunities to taste and live with the foods from the great cultures of the world. You can have Chinese, Malay, Indian, European food, and everything in between. There's very few places in the world you can do that. But I still know people who, only want to eat Indian food.
Yeah.
Right? I know Malays who only want to eat Malay food or a variation. So then they don't have an exposure. But once you go and try it, which is the majority of people in a multicultural society, then they get a taste for those different things. So food is, you got to get a taste for it. But similarly, if you want to understand a culture, watching it on TV is a form of exposure.
That's observing.
That's observing, and you could give it some credit. At least you're interested to watch. Some people don't even want to watch; they turn it off because it's not pop music. But going to the concert, going to the performance, not in a concert hall, but going to the village, taking the time to get there 3 hours and staying there for 4 hours and watching it, that's a different immersion. So that if you go to Indonesia, there are performances of the wayang kulit, the shadow plays, which can take 4 or 5 hours. Most of us these days do not even think we have the time to immerse in all of that. And so immersion is essentially a test of who you are, how much observational skills you have to digest, rather than something superficial. I'm just going to watch. So there's different levels of immersion. And I lived in Africa, and I'll just finish by saying I immersed myself in every time I had an opportunity to go somewhere. And I used to take some risk. And I'm not talking about death risk. But I should take risks. I should go places I had never been before because I wanted to immerse myself. I wanted to feel the dust. I wanted to taste the food. And as awkward as it was to me, and I wanted to be there. And you know what? 9 out of 10 times, I had an extraordinary experience.
Yeah, it is
something I could never imagine. Could never. But people plan too much, don't take risks, and they do the banal. And that is the difference. Watching TV and Netflix is not exposure. It's kind of like killing your brain. Go out there and get immersed, get dirty, smell it, feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And then get comfortable.
And then get comfortable with feeling uncomfortable.
Yes.
That's right, yeah. So we've moved from the anecdote that Chandran gave earlier about how his life used to be in the exposure and the immersion that's given him to how being spoon-fed culture is a shortcut and actually spending the time to
I can give one final example.
Sure.
I like to go to markets. For me, that's immersion. I am not interested in the shopping mall. I mean, being there, boring. What can you get? So whenever I go to a town, as busy as I am, I try and carve out 1 hour to rush to the market, and I'm so excited.
Speaking of carving out that hour, guys, Chandran is actually about to head to a market. We're in Jakarta. So that's all we've got time for. Thank you very much again, Chandran. If you're interested in the future of sustainability, please check out our content on the GIFT website. That's www.global-inst.com. We also have a Facebook page, so please send along your questions and we'll answer them in our Q&A section. Just search for The Interruption with Chandran Nair.
We return you now to your regularly scheduled program.
We don't need